Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves Jonathan Conricus, as well as Ariel Osaran. Jonathan, right now Hamas is still the main force inside Gaza, but when we see displays such as this, is it truly garnering more support among the Palestinians, or is it just instilling fear, or is it this mixture of both?
I think it's important for Hamas to try to portray a picture of victory. They've sustained heavy losses. Gaza is in ruins. Palestinians are devastated, and the buzz of victory that they may have felt on October the 7th and 8th is long gone. And today they're looking at a very dusty and somber reality in the Gaza Strip. What they're doing with their detailed and choreographed events, and we can see that the second hostage release choreographed event was more choreographed in better detail and higher resolution than the first one. They're definitely putting a lot of emphasis on it, and they want to appear as if they are victorious, and they want to show strength towards Arabs, towards other terrorist organizations in the region, towards the Palestinian population. And from their point of view, they're really extracting as much as they can from a single event. A lot of attention to detail, I must say, from a media perspective. And I think it's part of the negotiations, and it's part of their attempt to regain control over the Gaza Strip. It's
all this image of victory that we're seeing from both Hamas and from Israel as well, this changing of the narrative to say, look at these four brave, resilient women standing up on that stage despite all of the parades and charades that Hamas seems to be having. But meanwhile, Ariel, part of this as well sees the 200 Palestinian prisoners released, many of them high-level convicted prisoners, as we've just learned in this report as well.
Right. So regarding the 70 Palestinian prisoners who are to be deported, so the same sources in Hamas told i24 News International that Qatar had refused to accept these deported prisoners, and Turkey is willing to receive only 11 of them. They will temporarily be transferred to Egypt or to Qatar, and from there continue to a third country, whether it's Algeria, Tunisia, or any other country that is willing to take them. Once they arrive at their destination, the deported prisoners will be prohibited from leaving that area for at least 6 months.
Jonathan, is it more dangerous for Israel to deport these high-level Palestinian prisoners or keep them closer in the West Bank where they can actually monitor them?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're talking about, and I've heard this spoken about, the heavy price that Israel is paying. So, currently, it's still only an emotional price. It is an insult to the families of victims of these terrorists. It hurts, it's very painful, and it is, of course, let's say that it does damage to Israel's regional standing and deterrence to see convicted terrorists with buckets of Israeli blood, Israeli, American, French blood on their hands, being released from prison and received back as heroes by Palestinian society, whether spontaneous or orchestrated. But nevertheless, the images are. That isn't yet the price. Sadly, the price is when these terrorists will go back to being terrorists, and they will take their experience, their know-how, their connections, and go back to doing what they did before. And that is to murder Jews wherever they can get their hands on them. Then we will be really speaking about the price. And if history is any type of reference, last time that we freed lots of Palestinian terrorists, that turned into a massive wave of suicide bombings and murder of Israelis. I hope that won't happen this time. Regarding the location of where they are sent to, on one hand, it is more difficult for a Palestinian terrorist to establish connections, infrastructure, intelligence, and operational capabilities 2,000 miles away from Israel and the nearest Israeli target. So that's a positive. But then on the other hand, it is also more difficult for Israel to deal with those terrorists if they return to operating against Israel. So it's very important that if, let's say, they are deported to Algeria or to Turkey, that they indeed remain there. Turkey is not such a good example because there are Israeli targets in Turkey, and terrorists deported to Turkey could go and eventually attack those targets. Bottom line, there are advantages of keeping, as the old saying goes, you keep your enemies closest. If you have them close, they are within tactical distances of the IDF and Shabak to deal with them. If they stray from their very strict limitations, history again tells us that it's only a matter of time before they will do, and I hope that Israeli security forces will be ready to deal with them.
It's a double-edged sword, however, the price that Israel is willing to pay to get their lives and their Israeli civilians back. Coming back here in studio, Jonathan Conricus, right now, is there this risk and fear that the ceasefire could be collapsing on the northern front? Or is it possible that the Lebanese army can get their act together and come to the places where they have yet to deploy over the course of 8 weeks now?
So this was the first test for the Lebanese armed forces, and by all measures, they failed. They've got lots of support from the US and from the French. Many people around the world are hoping and rooting for and supporting the Lebanese armed forces. They have been slow, very slow to deploy. Looks like a very lackluster effort to deploy, mostly in the eastern sector, where where the terrain is more important and where the terrain on the Lebanese side is actually higher than in the Israeli side, and hence the importance of deploying there. In the western sector, we've seen Lebanese forces deploy, and there's less friction and less Israeli vulnerabilities, but the real action areas are in the eastern sector along what we call the Ramim Ridge, above Kiryat Shmona, the area of Metula, and the valley down below. So the first test of the Lebanese armed forces, they've failed. Second important observation would be about Hezbollah. A few months ago or a year ago, I don't think we could have imagined Israel overstaying a ceasefire in Lebanon, and the only thing that Hezbollah would have to say about it would be to send civilians forward. They would have fought. So there's something of importance, I think, to look at the situation of Hezbollah. They are not in the driving seat, they are not dictating events, and they're relegated to using softer tactics, media influence, etc., and sending civilians forward instead of fighting. And I'm sure that they're not happy with that situation that they're in. Now, where do we go from here? Obviously, there are Israeli and American understandings, unofficial or perhaps official understandings behind the scenes that allow Israel to continue to stay as long as it is necessary, and until the Lebanese armed forces deploy in the south and Hamas doesn't have access. Hezbollah doesn't have access. The big question is, how long is that going to take, and what will be enough in terms of security for Israel? It is a complex situation, because for there to be real security for Israeli civilians, in some areas Israel needs to create a 8-9 kilometer buffer zone for Israelis really to be safe, and that's only against the direct threat of sniper rifles and anti-tank missiles, not from long or mid-range rockets. So it is a complex tactical and strategic situation. I think that it is regrettable that the Lebanese armed forces are failing here, but what the US and the French are doing is, again, extending another request or additional support to the Lebanese armed forces to perhaps do it better next time. And very interesting to follow what Hezbollah are doing. Talk and media, but very little on the ground. Very little military force, and one of the likely or possible implications of that is also because of what we're seeing in Syria as well. In studio, Jonathan Conricus, I want your opinion when we hear something like this coming out of the now U.S. President Donald Trump. Could he make something like this truly happen? Because we've already heard from the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, and some of the other people in more of his far-right coalition thanking Trump for even touting this idea that many of them had also long tried to put on the table. Yeah. I don't believe it to be a coincidence, and I don't think that it's a one-off. Perhaps it's a bit of a trial balloon to test the waters, but I think that there's a lot behind this. When Israel agreed to the hostage release deal with Hamas, my initial response was, and I've said it since, including here, that there must be more to it than meets the eye, because the deal in itself is a horrible deal for Israel. It's quite good for Hamas, and therefore, since a very experienced and shrewd politician on the Israeli side signed the agreement, there must be more to it. I suppose that what we're seeing now is part of the additional appendixes that exist and that I think are very important. Now, feasibility, if we detach history, if we detach what most other Western countries feel and think about it, and most Arabic countries, then this would probably be the best and quickest way to alleviate suffering. No doubt about it, because if you have the area cleared out of people, you do the demolition of what needs to be demolished, and then you clear it out and you rebuild much, much faster than if you have to do it while you have shanty towns of about 1.5 million people that don't have other homes. But that has never really been the objective when it comes to global opinion and Palestinians. It has much more been about a thorn in the side of Israel than really the benefit of Palestinians or Gazans particularly. So maybe it can be done. Maybe a businessman like Trump can force it through in some kind of a deal. But anyhow, it is a very important taboo that has now been broken for the first time. And I do not believe that it is a mistake or a fluke. This is, I think, part of an interesting policy, and I think we will see very interesting things to follow.
Well, for more in studio, as we continue to talk about this ongoing operation from the IDF, specifically in Jenin right now, it seems to be that this is where the focus has been in the last week, as we have a ceasefire in Gaza, we have a ceasefire in Lebanon, but the West Bank is truly where it seems ripe to explode at any moment. And so this counterterrorism operation that the IDF has been conducting, is it truly effective, or is this all part of more of the minor scales that we're likely to see for many, many more days and years to come?
So the operation is very much needed. It's quite urgent. There's, as we know, the Palestinian Authority has been operating in Jenin out of their own priorities and in order to serve their own goals, not to protect Israelis, but to try to regain control over a city that they lost control over a long time ago. Jenin has always been the extreme of the extremes when it comes to the existence of terrorist organizations and the weakness of the Palestinian Authority. We've seen multiple new terrorist organizations rise up in Jenin and conduct attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilians. Just today, as you mentioned, a loaded IED that was ready to be deployed against Israelis was intercepted, and that's a success of one part of the operations. But there's multiple additional layers of infrastructure and operatives in Jenin. The IDF is speaking about dismantling the so-called Jenin battalion. When we say battalion, we're talking about between 120 and 150 operatives, real operatives with military training and weapons, which probably can be obtained. But for the time being, the IDF is operating at a relatively limited threshold. We're not seeing the deployment of really heavy weapons. We have seen the use of both fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft, which usually is a sign of escalation, but we have not yet seen battle tanks or the use of heavy machinery. So there's still many more layers of escalation to go. It's similar to the operation that Israel did about half a year ago in Tulkarem against terrorist infrastructure there. But if we really zoom out, and we've spoken about this in the past, the real strategic issue is, like with so many other issues, the flow of weapons and who provides the weapons to these organizations. And for the last 2, 3, 4 years, Israel has had a significant weakness, and that has been our border with Jordan. That is where weapons have been smuggled in from Iran, Iraq, Syria, northern Jordan, and then finally into the northern part of Samaria. And that is what our troops and civilians are facing in Jenin now. So this approach, and with this I'll close, there's combat needed in Jenin, and there's lots of terrorists that need to be either detained or killed. But the real issue is to close and protect and defend that eastern border, and the IDF is starting now to do that, so that these terrorists, they may have the desire to fight, but that they will be deprived of the means and the capabilities to do so.
This is just possibly the initial operation into what needs to possibly be more large-scale.
And I don't think that it'll be contained to Jenin only. We can more than likely see this spread over to Nablus. There's lots of terrorist activity in Jericho. And of course, the crown jewel of Hamas outside of Gaza is in Hebron, and it could go there as well.
I want to come back here in studio as we continue to hear from the family members of these women who have now been released. It's difficult for them to come up there on the podium and speak, but the people that they specifically had to thank to this, one of them being the United States, the Trump administration, Right now, are these assurances from the Trump administration, do they have a lot of weight over Israel to make sure that this ceasefire continues to hold despite all of the violations that we're also already seeing on Hamas's end?
Yeah, I think it was interesting that there were, unless there was a Hebrew announcement that we didn't hear before.
We heard from at least 3 of the different family members from the other hostages.
Maybe then thanks were given to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't know. But at least in English we didn't hear one, and I think that is of interest that they chose not to. Maybe there's a purpose behind it. But I assess and believe that the coordination and the communications between the US and Israel on this topic are on a very solid footing, and that what Israel is doing is coordinated with the Americans, and therefore there is more leeway, more flexibility. I'm not entirely sure that Israel would have been able to participate in this basically game of chicken with Hamas, which is what has been happening over the last 2 days, where Israel is demanding and setting a very clear and firm price. If Hamas doesn't implement what it is supposed to implement according to the agreement, then Israel won't comply. Sadly, I think that in the past we have been very soft and lenient with Hamas when it came to negotiations, etc. But this time Israel said, well, if you don't comply, then Gazans are not going to move north. And if they will try to move north, the IDF is deployed and there will be consequences. And I think we saw the consequences in Lebanon, that I think that resonated in Gaza as well. So that is interesting, and I think that there's good coordination. Again, that could be part of the deal, and that could be part of the bigger picture here of Israeli-US relations. Bottom line, where tomorrow will be, I believe, the 16th day, which is when negotiations are supposed to start about the implementation of the next deal, if there is one. The fate of the 66, I believe 65 Israeli men still left in Hamas captivity. And that is everything that we're seeing is a prelude to or part of those negotiations as well.